All right, so we're finishing Leviticus today. Just quickly, we'll start with that. We talked about last time there's two big themes in the book of Leviticus as we're moving through the Old Testament. The first big theme being that God is holy, which literally means that He is different than everything else. He is set apart. He is transcendent. And that because of that, if you're going to follow that God, you too must be holy. That is, to put it simply, your life should look different than the life of a non-Christian. Your life should look different and different enough that the outsider can tell, different than the non-Christian. That if God is holy, those who follow Him must also be holy. That's one of the big themes of Leviticus. And the second big theme is the need of atonement. That sin must be paid for. That without exception, every sin that's ever committed, ever has been committed or will be committed, will be paid for. You either pay for it yourself or Christ paid for it for you. Those are the only two options for all sin, always. And we're showed over and over in Leviticus that the way sin is handled is by sacrifice, and particularly by the blood of the Lamb. Look at Leviticus 17, verse 11. This sort of thing is said throughout the book, but it said one of the places clearly here. Leviticus 17, verse 11. Says, "The life of the creature or the flesh is in the blood, and I have given the blood for you on the altar to make atonement for your souls. For it is the blood that makes atonement for one's life." So we're told very early, in fact earlier than this, but clearly here in Leviticus, that the way atonement is made for sins is through blood. Now what they thought that meant was we kill the lambs or the goats or the bulls or whatever it is they were killing for that particular sacrifice, and that animal's blood pays for the sin. But all that animal was doing was rolling that sin forward so that Christ would pay for all of it with His blood, the one blood that was worth the sort of payment that was required. Hebrews 10:4, the blood of bulls and goats never takes away sin, which is why Christ needed the body. Keep a marker there, we'll be back in a second, but look at Hebrews chapter 9. We're starting a series in Hebrews this coming week, which will probably be in the rest of the year, or close to it. It'll be the longest series we've done yet, certainly. I am very excited about it. In fact, the reason we started this series, 4 months ago, I think this is week 16 or 17, was because I knew we'd be going through Hebrews soon, and Hebrews is so Old Testament rich that you really have to have a pretty good basis of Old Testament theology to understand what is being said in Hebrews. So we're starting that Sunday, and I think you'll see how much of all the things we've been talking about are relevant to that book. Hebrews chapter 9, Hebrews 9, verse 22. There's many places we could go, but we'll go to this one. Hebrews 9, 22. Saying, "This is the blood of the covenant that God commanded for you. And in the same way, He sprinkled with the blood both the tent and all the vessels used in worship." We've read that already. Verse 22, "Indeed, under the law, almost everything is purified with blood, and without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sins." And we can spend time talking about why that's the case and coming up with answers for that. But the clear answer for why Christ had to die is because the only way sins are ever cared for is by the shedding of blood, by the sacrifice of that which is innocent. This is, of course, why there's so much stress in Leviticus about how the lamb has to be spotless, without blemish, all those things, because it's, of course, pointing forward to Christ. Look back at verse 11, actually, in chapter 9. Same book, Hebrews 9:11. "When Christ appeared as a high priest for the good things that have come, then through the greater and more perfect tabernacle, not made with hands, that is, not of this creation, He entered once for all into the holy places, not by means of the blood of goats and calves, but by means of His own blood, thus securing an eternal redemption. For if the blood of goats and bulls and the sprinkling of defiled persons with the ashes of a heifer sanctify for the purification of the flesh, how much more will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered Himself without blemish to God, purify our conscience from dead works to serve the living God?" So much of our understanding of what Christ did comes from Old Testament books that are quite boring, like Leviticus. That if we didn't have this Old Testament imagery, motifs of sacrifice and the killing of the lambs, and all those things required blood being spilled for forgiveness of sins, then so much of the New Testament wouldn't make any sense to us. If you started with Matthew and had no understanding of the Old Testament at all, and you come and hear about Christ as the Lamb of God, that doesn't make any sense. As the one who is sacrificed, well, why is He sacrificed? As the one whose blood is the thing that is powerful to save and to cleanse. Those things wouldn't have any sort of understanding if we didn't have these Old Testament passages. But of course, with them, everything becomes much more rich. We have, throughout Leviticus, we have sacrifices for guilt. We have sacrifices for broken relationships. We have sacrifices for being made holy. All sorts of things. And all of these, of course, are pointing forward to the one sacrifice that Christ would make that would do all those things. Christ's one sacrifice would cover your guilt, would heal your relationship with God and with others, would make you holy, etc., etc. One scholar said this: we cannot imagine how weird Christianity was in the early world. Imagine a Christian moves in next door to a pagan in the first century, a Roman god worshiper. The pagan realizes that this guy's a Christian, and the pagan's being friendly, and he asks, well, okay, where's your temple? And he said, well, we don't have a temple. Jesus is our temple. He said, no temple. Well, then where do your priests work? He said, well, we don't have any priests. Jesus is our priest. You don't have any priests. Well, who offers your sacrifices? Oh, we don't offer sacrifices. Christ is our sacrifice. Right? Everything that meant religion in the first century was accomplished by Christ. He was all those things. Our entire religion is Christ. Full stop. So, we have these two big themes of holiness and atonement. Okay, the book of Numbers. So we're going to move forward to the book of Numbers, which the general idea of why it's called Numbers is because there's a couple of censuses. Is that the plural of census? Is it censi? Censin? I think censuses. That feels right. That may not be right. Is Nathan in here yet? Because he'll correct me if I'm wrong. He always enjoys that. There's multiple census. When David counts the people, or when the people of Israel are counted, not David, that's later. But the people of Israel are counted, and what that does is it sets the stage for what the book is going to be about, right? Exodus is about the Israelites being liberated. Leviticus is about the Israelites being sanctified. Numbers is about the Israelites being made ready for war, to be a fighting people, to go and take claim on their inheritance. The first 10 chapters of the book of Numbers, they're still at Mount Sinai. So we've been at Mount Sinai since the middle of Exodus. They're still at Mount Sinai until Numbers chapter 10, which we'll get to in a second. Interesting side note, the tribe of Levi are the ones who are priests, right? You know that probably. The tribe of Levi are the ones who are made priests. Anyone know when they could start acting as priests? Because you were born into the tribe of Levi, but at what age you began acting as the priest? That's right. Well, technically, it was 25 to start, and it was 30 to carry the tent. But with David, eventually it got moved back to 20. So at age 20, if you were a tribe of Levi, you could be a priest. Now just remember that for the future. That's an interesting thing. There is no given age of accountability in the Bible. The closest thing we have to it is probably much older than we think. Like 20 even. But anyway, we'll look at that more closely in a moment. God and uncleanness. Look at chapter 5, Numbers chapter 5. So the first bit, we're still hanging out at Sinai. It's still very much similar to Leviticus, a lot of the same sort of laws. Chapter 5, verse 1. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, command the people of Israel that they put out of the camp everyone who's leprous or has a discharge, and everyone who's unclean through contact with the dead. You shall put out both male and female, putting them outside the camp, that they may not defile their camp, in the midst of which I dwell. There's a theme throughout the Old Testament, we've already seen a lot, we're going to keep seeing, that is preparing us to understand why we must be made righteous. Because God cannot dwell in the midst of the unrighteous, cannot dwell in the midst of the unclean. And so here we have the unclean people being put out of the tent. The reason for that is, out of the city. The reason for that is because that is where God dwells. The obvious problem that is, again, rolling us forward to the New Testament, as we're reading this text, thinking about our need for Christ, the problem is, of course, that we're all unclean. And so in order to be in the midst of God, something has got to happen, right? The appropriate response is, since we are all unclean by sin, that we are left out of the city of God. And if something doesn't happen to clean us, that will be the end result. All people will be left out of the city of God unless that cleanliness problem is solved. Okay, look at chapter 6. We're just hitting on a few kind of high notes here in the first chapters. Things to notice. Chapter 6, verse 22 to what's called the priestly blessing. If you've been a Christian for a while, it's something you've heard probably several times in your life. the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to Aaron and his sons, saying, This you shall bless the people of Israel, thus, and you shall say to them, verse 24, The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. And then he says, So shall they put my name upon the people of Israel, and I will bless them. You've heard that before. Many churches end the service every Sunday with that statement, that blessing, that priestly blessing on the people. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. This is likely what Paul has in mind when he starts and finishes every letter he writes with grace and peace, probably from this blessing. Let the Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you, give you peace. This grace and peace idea is probably from this blessing. Paul starts every one of his letters that way, ends every one of his letters that way. Something like grace and peace to you, ends the letter with grace and peace with you. Probably quoting this priestly blessing. And then look down at chapter 8. Chapter 8. Verse 9. Chapter 8, verse 9. We have a new category of sacrifice here, which is interesting. You shall bring the Levites before the tent of meeting and assemble the whole congregation of the people of Israel. When you bring the Levites before the Lord, the people of Israel shall lay their hands on the Levites. And Aaron shall offer the Levites before the Lord as a wave offering from the people of Israel, that they may do the service of the Lord. Then the Levites shall lay their hands on the head of the bulls, and you shall offer the one for a sin offering, the one for a burnt offering to the Lord, and make atonement for the Levites. And you shall set the Levites before Aaron and his sons, and shall offer them as a wave offering to the Lord. So here we have the Levites, the priests, those who are given to God's service, being offered to the Lord. They place their hands on them like they would the lambs and the goats, and they offer the Levites to the Lord, but they don't kill them. The Levites become what is referred to as a living sacrifice. Right? They stay alive, they keep living, but their life is given as a sacrifice to God. As they continue living, they are the living and not killed sacrifice. Of course, Romans chapter 12, verse 1, I'll quote it to you, but you can look it up if you want. I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercy of God, to present your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. So what's in view there is the same idea. That in the same way the Levites were dedicating their entire lives to God, that the Christian form of worship is the same, that we dedicate ourselves to God, that we are living sacrifices, offering ourselves entirely to the King. Okay, Numbers 10 is where we shift gears into the sort of next phase of the Torah, the next phase of these books. Look at verse 11. In the second year, so this is from the time that they left Egypt. In the second year, in the second month, on the 20th day of the month, the cloud lifted from over the tabernacle of the testimony. Okay, so remember when the cloud sits on the tabernacle, they don't move, and they haven't moved since they got to Sinai a couple years ago. The cloud now lifts up, and so they're about to move. Okay, they begin their journey. And the people of Israel, verse 12, set out by stages from the wilderness of Sinai, and the cloud settled down in the wilderness of Paran. They set out for the first time at the command of the Lord by Moses. Then he goes through the camp of the people that were setting out. Okay, so they leave. They head out for the first time since they got to Sinai. Look down at verse 33. So they set out from the mount of the Lord, that's Sinai, 3 days' journey. And the ark of the covenant of the Lord went before them 3 days' journey to seek out a resting place for them. And the cloud of the Lord was over them by day whenever they set out from the camp. And whenever the ark set out, Moses said, Arise, O Lord, and let your enemies be scattered, and let those who hate you flee before you. And when it rested, he said, Return, O Lord, to the 10,000s of Israel. This phrase, there's a whole psalm, Psalm 68, you can read later if you want. There's a whole psalm that is quoting this passage, quoting these statements of Moses, where he's declaring victory for God as he sets out, declaring victory for God's people if they continue following that God. And then the key thing we want to get to today is Numbers 11, verse 1. When the people complained in the hearing of the Lord about their misfortunes, and when the Lord heard it, his anger was kindled, and the fire of the Lord burned among them, and consumed some outlying parts of the camp. Then the people cried out to Moses, and Moses prayed to the Lord, and the fire died down. So the name of the place was called Taberah, because the fire of the Lord burned among them. Verse 4, now the rabble that was among them had a strong craving, and the people of Israel also wept again and said, oh, that we had meat to eat. We remember the fish we ate in Egypt that cost nothing, the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, and the garlic. But now our strength is dried up, and there's nothing at all but this manna to look at. We come back to this again, right, where we have the Israelites being set free from Exodus, or from Egypt, crossing the Red Sea to get to the wilderness. First thing they do is grumble, whine, complain, various words used. Once again, they leave Sinai after seeing God speak from the mountaintop and the mountain shake with thunder and lightning. And then as soon as they get away, 3 days, they started over again, grumbling, complaining, whining. Oh, that we could go back to Egypt, where the meat and fish were free, as if they weren't slaves working entirely all day. They were shocked that in the desert they didn't have any fish. And here they found themselves upset again, but all they had was this manna. Why does, if you're a parent, this will be a sharper question, but it's true of all of you. Why does grumbling and complaining bother us so much? Why is that? Why is that? Like, as a parent, why does almost nothing make me more frustrated, on edge, than a child that is endlessly complaining? Let me say it again. Because they're ungrateful. Listen, and here's a little bit of vindication for you, dear parent. The people complained in the hearing of the Lord, this is verse 1 again, about their misfortunes. And when the Lord heard it, his anger was kindled. And so much so that fire came down and burned the edges of the city. I think my kids would tell you that it seems like fire comes down on the edges of my house sometimes when they are ungrateful and complaining because of my less than holy wrath. But there is this, it's not just that, it's the wrong thing to do, right? My kids do things that are the wrong thing to do all the time. But there's something extra about complaining. There's something more that's frustrating about grumbling, something more painful. And I think at bottom it is that they're ungrateful. They have the audacity to be a child that is just mooching off of me in everything and be ungrateful. Miss Rebecca, you got something?
Well, I was just going to say, the root of that is you're not counting your blessings.
Yeah, for sure.
You're not counting and thinking about dwelling on what God has done for you.
Yeah, that's so good. How easy it is to be focused on the things that are difficult. But yeah, that's good. What else? Any other thoughts on that? Why it bothers us so much? Why it drives us so insane?
Well, we need so very little, and God gives us
Yeah,
abundantly
that's good.
more than we actually
Yeah.
need to survive.
Yeah, that's so good. Yeah, because of the abundance, it's even more frustrating. Because of the abundance of God's blessings. And, by extension, because of the abundance of your blessings to your children, right? It's all the same sort of, that there is something redemptive in our frustrations at complaining and at whining. God felt the same way. Moses felt the same way. And it's important that, like, to God, grumbling is no little thing, right? Complaining is no little thing to God. It's a big deal to be a complainer. It's a big deal to be a grumbler. And goodness, just colloquially, like, people like that. You know people that live like, and you, if we're honest, except in your best Christian moments, you avoid them at all costs, right? And so do I, because it's draining in a way that nothing else really is, right? The negativity, the complaining, it does more to us psychologically than we probably realize, right? It's difficult and draining and hard because there's something at the very bottom of us, right? Whether you're a Christian or not, something at the very bottom of us that knows that we have been shown absolute abundance of grace and that all we have is from somewhere that's not of our own, and that to respond in any way but with gratitude is not just incorrect, it's offensive. It's offensive. It's offensive to me as a parent when my children spend time complaining, right? That's offensive to me as a parent. How much more offensive is it to the perfect God, the perfect Father, when we live lives of complaining, live lives of negativity? Much less, like, not even getting to the point of when you're complaining and grumbling, you're just saying, God has not done right by me, right? God should have done this differently. God should have given me something different. God should have put something else on my plate. God gave me the wrong thing. Like, all the things that you're saying that we say when we are ungrateful are totally against faithfulness, totally against loyalty to God, which just says, in our best moments, when we are loyal to God, when we're showing our faith, we are saying, God, your will be done. Right? That is the Christian statement, and that sometimes means my suffering.
Well, in essence, it means that we're trying to control.
Yeah, that's good.
Especially
Yeah,
where a child is concerned.
right.
They figure if they grumble and complain enough, you're going to give in. So
Yeah,
they control things.
that's good.
Think that about God too, like, if we, say enough about it, he'll just go, all right, quit swimming.
Yeah,
Do whatever it is.
yeah.
So it's a manipulation.
Yeah, it's a desiring to be God, right? Which is the bottom of all of us. We're designed to be the ones that call the shots. We see it in the Garden of Eden, of course. You read the story of the Garden of Eden, and you think, what a garden, what a place, what a paradise, what a situation these two are in. And yet still they find some way to be ungrateful. And yet still they find some way to complain. Oh man, God's keeping that from us. Must be because he hates us. Like it's just, there's all these sort of reasons to take us those places. Look at 1 Corinthians chapter 10. 1 Corinthians chapter 10. This period, you're going to see this in Hebrews more than anywhere else when we get there. This period of grumbling and complaining and whining in this wilderness period is referenced a lot in the New Testament, mostly in Hebrews. But here's one of those places, 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 9. Says, we must not put Christ to the test, as some of them did and were destroyed by serpents, nor grumble, as some of them did and were destroyed by the destroyer. Verse 11, these things, this is talking about the wilderness, these things happened to them as an example, but they were written down for our instruction, on whom the end of the ages has come. Therefore, let anyone thinks that he stands take heed lest he fall. We have a tendency to look at the Israelites and say, man, what fools. How could they possibly? And the reality is, they weren't just a bad example. They were a mirror to that which is at the bottom of us, right? That we too are like that so often in our lives. We often are ungrateful. We are often the complainer. We are often the grumbler. We're often the one who has the audacity to think that way. So Israel wasn't an outlier. They were a mirror. One very similar example. Look at Mark chapter 9. Mark chapter 9. Starting verse 31. For he, that's Jesus, 31, was teaching his disciples, saying to them, okay, listen to the message. The Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men, and they will kill him. And when he is killed, after 3 days he will rise. But they did not understand the saying and were afraid to ask him. Verse 33. And they came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, he asked them, what were you discussing on the way here? Verse 34. But they kept silent, for on the way they had argued with one another about who was the greatest. Oh, I love that. Isn't that wonderful? They were arguing with one another about who was the greatest. This happens a few times in the New Testament, in each of the books, right? It's more than one occasion, I should say. It happens more than one occasion in the Gospels, where the disciples have this exact same discussion. And each time you think, how could you fools be doing this again? How could you fools be next to the God who is literally laying himself down, making himself nothing, taking the form of a servant, being humbled to the point of death, even death on a cross, being next to that Jesus, and be arguing about which one of you is the highest, which one of you is the greatest, which one of you will sit on his right hand. There's parallels between the Israelites and the Old Testament, and we read about the Israelites and we say, how could they be doing this? But then nothing changes. The disciples are no different. You and I are no different. Arguing about who is the greatest next to the king, who is laying himself down. Grumbling, complaining, finding something to be ungrateful for, something to argue about, something to compare ourselves to others with, is poison. And it seems to be, apparently, a flavor of poison that we humans particularly enjoy. So we see the Israelites whining. We see the disciples no differently, complaining and arguing about who the greatest is amidst the absurdities. It's not an outlier when humans act absurdly to God. It is the pattern. That's who we are. And outside of the grace of Christ, that is who we would still be. So we have, you can go back to Numbers. We have this grumbling, again, of course. We have disdain for the manna, which is described here as bread cooked with oil, or as cakes cooked with oil. Very similarly, by the way, to a foreshadowing of how they will indeed disdain the bread of life, right? The bread that is giving them life in the desert. Christ is called the bread of life, not coincidentally, the thing that God has sent entirely freely of His grace, and yet His people would still disdain. His people would still turn away from, in the same way they turned away from the manna. Committed people who voluntarily come to God. It's relational by definition, right? In the same way that I couldn't force Ariel to love me when I wanted her to marry me. I couldn't force that to happen. The same thing is true with God, right? The goal of God is not just get married at all cost. The goal of God is to have those who love Him and that He loves. Papa?